Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, January 31st. How you feeling?
Um, I'm feeling good.
All right, that's good.
I
That's
don't,
good. Well,
nothing
what's been
exceptional, but no problems.
okay? What's been on your mind these past 48 hours since our last podcast?
Well, the world.
You can't always give
Uh,
that answer.
I'm sorry. Well, Trump, just the whole Trump phenomenon, what it might mean, and then of course Ukraine and the Middle East.
Hmm.
Um,
So, okay, well, maybe we'll start with Ukraine then. Is
okay.
Ukraine in a bit of a meltdown now after this freezing of foreign aid? From my understanding, 90% of Ukrainia's media funding came from the United States,
Right.
and now it's gone. So I imagine there's a bit of a
Yeah.
crisis. And then,
Uh,
okay, we'll just start with that.
well, yeah, I think it has created something of a crisis. Certainly, a panic among the ruling class in Ukraine. Um, my understanding is that military aid has continued unabated. I mean, there's been some controversy over that. Again, it's a State Department suspension of aid, and in general, the State Department is not responsible for sending weapons and other military material to foreign countries. But apparently, there is some category called military assistance, and that was part of the State Department suspension, the 90-day suspension. Now, nobody has actually pointed to what that actually is. So I'm rather, it's not clear that in fact any military aid has been suspended at all. Well, we'll see if this 90-day freeze does have the effect, does extend to some military assistance, so called. I think it's going to be very minor. The general flow of military equipment to Ukraine has not stopped. In fact, we got very uh, clear proof of this recently, with the news that Israel had transferred 90 Patriot missiles to Poland, and from Poland they're going to go into Ukraine. So, it's business as usual so far in that regard. But as you say, this um, a lot of foreign aid was going to Ukraine. I don't know exactly how much was going through through these programs, but it must be, billions. Yeah, and it's interesting that an exception was not carved out for Ukraine. I think that in itself is very significant. Exceptions were carved out for Israel, of course, and Egypt, because Egypt is basically paid off to remain Israel's friend. It's a surprise that Jordan was not also made an exception. I think in some of the first reports, Jordan was listed as an exception to the freeze, but that does not seem to be the case. It's just Israel and Egypt, and then of course Ukraine was not accepted. Now there are a lot of people apparently in the State Department and elsewhere that are screaming, "You got to make an exception for Ukraine." But so far, Trump and Rubio have stuck to their guns and have cut these programs. So you are hearing a lot of howling of protests from Ukraine and from its supporters, especially with regard to these media organizations, some of them which were very, very interesting, let's say. I think there was one that was clearly, I think you really can call neo-Nazi. It was by some C-14 leader. Now, C-14, it's the kind of the 14 words of white nationalism that David Lane, a well-known white nationalist from years ago, that he composed. And right now, those words escape me at the moment. I
I was
think
going to
like
ask you. I want to know what these
I think
words
it is
are.
something like to secure a future for white people and white children or something. It's something along those lines. I didn't get it
Mm.
quite right. But that's why this organization in Ukraine is called C-14. Now, David Lane may not be as evil as people make him out to be and all that, but that's the general conception. This guy's a neo-Nazi. He's really scary, and now we have this organization that is, looking to him as a model, and they were receiving U.S. funding. And I think you also find it's yeah, but we had learned earlier, before this cutoff, that in fact, Ukraine has a kill list, right? It's properly called a kill list because they list people that, are declared enemies of Ukraine, and some of those people get, assassinated. Um, and
And they say liquidated on it, right? After
yeah, right,
right.
yeah. So they're not, they're quite open about it. That it turned out was receiving U.S. funding. So maybe the kill list won't be funded any longer. Yeah, it is creating. Obviously, it's got to be very worrying, even though they continue to receive military equipment. It certainly is going to make them fear that perhaps the military equipment could suffer the same fate. That flow could be cut off too. Um, yeah, I'm actually surprised that there isn't more howling. Maybe they're confident that this is just sort of a temporary, symbolic gesture. We'll see. Um, yeah, but they certainly are. It's clear they're nervous, and with good reason. I think they should be nervous.
Do you think it would be more impactful if military aid was cut off, or what just happened right here, the cutting off of aid to support Ukrainian media, Ukrainian propaganda? Which in the end do you think has more of an impact?
Well, as we've said, it's just like this. The narrative in this postmodern world is shapes reality. So you could argue, well, it's hard to say, because look, without the military equipment, in the end, they can't fight. It's going to be a matter of a couple of weeks, at the most a couple of months, and then it really is over. I'm truly over. It's just they're just going to have to wave the white flag, and the Russians will just march wherever they go. So it's hard to say that cutting off aid to propaganda outlets would have as dramatic of effect. But in the long run, it could have a very significant effect. Because as we've noted, it's just that so much of what let's say American politicians, other Western elites believe about Ukraine comes from this propaganda. They've allowed this propaganda to shape their perception of the conflict in Ukraine, of Russia, and so forth. Look, of course, a lot of the anti-Russia perceptions and sentiments precede this conflict, so we can't put it all on the shoulders of these propaganda outlets. But it may, strike let's say, even if material military equipment continues to flow to Ukraine, if you do cut this off, that could have long-term repercussions. I don't think it would change anything in the short run. People don't change their ideas immediately. But if there is a real reduction in the flow of false information from Ukraine, over time, people are going to start to develop a more balanced view, and that could have very serious long-term consequences. And, I think it is vital. It's just like, I've talked about the JCPOA in Iran before. So, the Obama administration, one of the few things, in my opinion, that they few good things that they did was to reach this agreement with Iran. But I remember noticing at the time that they didn't make any effort to change the narrative. The Iranians are not to be trusted. They were wicked. They were insane. They were hell bent on destroying Israel. So you had all those things there, and then it was quite easy for the next president, who was Donald Trump, to tear up the agreement. Because you had that narrative, and so there was hardly a peep of protest. And you could say the same thing about Ukraine. If you don't stop the propaganda, if you don't change the narrative, then whatever you do, even if you did have some kind of ceasefire or whatever, or de-escalation, that narrative's always there, and it's just easy to start everything up again. So I think that no matter what happens to the military equipment, this would be, I think, a very helpful move in starting. It's not going to happen right away, but in the long run could help to to alter the narrative, to bring it closer to reality.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I believe that's how you can truly end this conflict. Because, like you said, if you keep on pumping in that propaganda, it's just a matter of time before it rears its head again. So this is a real change. And also, you can even argue that, I mean, do you know what's really slowing the Russian advance down? What equipment is it that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine that's really hampering them? I mean, are they running? I know there's always been a shortage of 155 millimeter artillery shells, but I mean, in my opinion, it's a lot of it is the drones which are made domestically
Yeah,
in Ukraine. Like that's really
right.
the big thing, and that's the only thing that's really causing real damage, from my understanding, in Russia. Just a day or two ago, they hit an oil refinery with some of these drones. These drones
Yeah,
can be done much more impact on the war than the ATACMS or the Storm
right,
Shadows.
right. Yeah, no,
So
I think it is the drones. That's what when I read first or listen to firsthand accounts of the combat, it's the drones that everybody talks about. Recently I listened to Patrick Lancaster, who is an American living in the Donbass. I think he's married to a woman in the Donbass. And he's a very brave man. We'll just say that. I mean, he goes right up to the, 100 meters, from the Ukrainian lines and reports from the trenches. And recently he went into Kursk region, and uh, yeah, he described the drones, the soldiers. He was going with a small group of soldiers passing through the woods, approaching the front lines, and every time they went out into a field, as they had to from time to time, that you'd look up in the sky. And each soldier would carry or not, perhaps not every one of them. Let's say every platoon definitely had a couple people with these drone detectors. And the drone detectors, every time they went off, and they went off frequently, you look up and if you saw a drone, you ran, you hid, and you were in constant terror of the drones. He said it was particularly bad. He had been down in the Donbass, and yeah, it's definitely a problem there. And, it's one reason why the Russians, they have to proceed cautiously. But it was even worse in Kursk. It's clear that the Ukrainian forces there were just flooding the area with drones. Now, of course, the Russians have even more drones, so it's an even greater terror for the Ukrainians. But yeah, that's what seems to be the main obstacle to a more that is preventing a more rapid advance by the Russians. It is drones, and yeah, I think drones are a lot of it is a lot of them are manufactured locally in Ukraine and in small workshops, which makes it hard for the Russians to target them, in basements of buildings and houses, that kind of thing. Of course, the components have to come from overseas, and but again, the Russians really can't prevent that. So that is a problem. But if everything else stops flowing, the drones will not be anywhere near enough to really slow down the Russians. If they just don't have any more, artillery at all, if they completely run out of air interceptors, air defense interceptors, then it'll be then the Russians will be able to fly overhead and bomb, directly. Now their MiGs, and their other combat aircraft launch these glide bombs from several kilometers or miles back. But if there are no longer any interceptors, then they can actually just drop bombs from overhead. That'll just make it all easier. So anyway, the drones are a persistent problem, but the Ukrainians can't rely on just the drones.
right. Well, it doesn't seem like Israel's sending 90 Patriot missiles. It doesn't seem like these Patriot interceptor missiles have much of an impact, though, right? Because even if you do have a few, sure, they're not flying right overhead, but it seems like with these glide bombs, they're able to hit the front line as much as they want. And if they want to hit behind the line, they have these hypersonics to hit infrastructure. Yeah. Do you think that this is going to have much of an impact at sending in 90 interceptor missiles?
No, it'll have very little impact. First of all, to have a reasonable chance of actually hitting an incoming missile, you need to fire two Patriot interceptors. So we're talking about, okay, 45. Okay, let's say you have 45 missiles incoming, and drones for that matter. Okay, well, you have to fire all 90 of these interceptors. So that's it. It's over. And the Russians send in, launch these attacks on basically, every night. Probably every other night there are 45, maybe every night, drones and missiles coming in. So at best it would be like one night's worth. And then, of course, we're saying fire at them, but they don't hit them, more than like something like 30% of the time, even according to the Ukrainians themselves. So no, it's going to have virtually no impact. It's pretty much meaningless.
Why would Israel do something like this? You think Israel wouldn't want to piss off Russia, right? What's the relationship right now between Israel and Russia?
Well, okay. Well, this is an interesting question. I think that may have been a reason that they didn't release these earlier. Now, we heard that they had to decommission their Patriot systems, I think about close to a year ago, which was a real blow to, I think, U.S. prestige. I don't think that news was given the attention that it should have, because they said, basically, these aren't very helpful systems, the Patriots, and that their own systems, we're talking about the Arrow
David
air
Sling.
defense system, David Sling, that kind of thing. They felt were more effective. But why would they not send it back then? Well, I think we have to look at what happened in Syria. And, there was kind of a very sort of an understanding between the Russians and the Israelis. Now, the Russians protected Syria. They had good air defense systems, a lot of S-300 systems, which are, they're older systems, but they're still very, very effective. And they did much to protect Syrian territory. There were some comments like, the Russians aren't doing anything, but we saw the difference after the fall of Assad. After the fall of Assad, then the Israelis went in and they just destroyed everything. They could fly through Syrian airspace without fear. Before they could not. Actually all those missiles, and there were a lot of attacks on Syria under Assad, but they were always from planes, let's say, over Lebanon or over Jordan or from over Israel itself. They didn't dare go into Syrian airspace, but now they can. And they can bomb at will. Well, when Assad was in power and the Russians were there, they're still there, but now they've retreated to these bases, of course, on the coast. But back then they were, the Russians were not exactly integrated with the Syrian armed forces, but they had a presence through much of Syria. The Israelis, well, had to. Okay, well, I described that the Russians were defending the airspace of Syria, but they could have done more. They could have allowed the Syrians to actually fire at these, let's say, F-35s that the Israelis would send over Lebanon and bring them down. But they didn't allow them to do that. I think it was just something they wanted to avoid conflict with Israel. And the Israelis understood that, but they had to keep their part of the bargain, and they didn't want to antagonize the Russians too much, because if they did, then the Russians might lift that restriction, on Syrian air defense, and allow them to shoot down planes over Lebanon and or maybe over Jordan or wherever. But now that Assad is gone, the Israelis don't have to worry about this. They don't have that same fear of antagonizing the Russians, and that may be, it hasn't been stated, but I think this may be the explanation for why why the Israelis have chosen to make the transfer now.
So is there still air defenses in Syria, or I thought Israel? I know they went on an extensive campaign of destroying all military equipment.
They just remember there was for several days in a row, maybe even a couple of weeks. They just bombed on military facilities and weapons depots, ammunition depots in Syria, and it was just a constant thing. They pretty much destroyed the military infrastructure of Syria, and I think that very much included the air defense systems. I can't say for sure that they got all of them, but I think they got, if they didn't get all of them, they got nearly all of them, all of the air defense systems.
Right. Well, I'll go back to my original question, though. It's just the relationship between Israel and Russia. I mean, clearly sending 90 Patriot missiles, they're doing it now. Okay, sure, they're not so worried about Syria, but that's definitely going to be put a strain on that relationship. Russia's going to view Israel as, okay, you're aiding, the
Yeah,
enemy that we're fighting that's in an existential war for us right now. You have joined
yeah,
yourselves with the rest
right.
of the West, and from my understanding, I think almost something like 20-30% of Israeli Jews are of, Russian or Ukrainian, Eastern European descent. A lot of
Mhm.
Russians are in Israel. So isn't this going to damage that relationship heavily? Do you think that's going to,
Well, I wouldn't say it's
how,
going to damage it heavily. It may do some damage to it, but the relationship has already taken a turn for the worse. Relations between Israel and Russia were actually pretty friendly prior to October 7th. But since then, they've deteriorated, and they've deteriorated, steadily. Now that relations are pretty poor between Russia and Israel. Um, yeah, if you look at the votes that are taken in the UN, Russia is consistently, sided with the Chinese and with basically the whole world except the West against Israel. They've taken a very clear stand, and not only is are the government to government relations much worse than they used to be, but the populace in Russia has a different view of Israel. They had a fairly positive view, not like you find in the U.S. or the U.K. or anything, um, but they did have a fairly positive view of Russia, not Russia rather, of Israel. Now that has really changed, and now that it's clear that the Russians, as a people, support the Palestinians against the Israelis. Um, so I don't think, maybe at this point, Israel realizes, especially after the fall of Assad, that it doesn't really have a whole lot to lose. And, 90 Patriot interceptors really don't mean a whole lot. Maybe it's just they looking at it and say, okay, yeah, this may irritate the Russians, but it also, will please the Americans. And we don't really even want these things anymore. So we're just going to fork them over.
right? The more that I just hear about this conflict and this war, hearing about our Patriot interceptors, how they're just essentially pretty worthless if they have to, they're very expensive. They don't have a very good success rate. And just
Mm-hmm.
everything about our military, it seems like everything that we've sent to Ukraine doesn't work. And we talk about the only thing that Russians are really afraid of are the drones. And that's not our forte at all. The US doesn't produce these types of cheap, small, FPV drones. They're made, I mean, China makes most of them. Obviously, the components mostly come from China, and then the Ukrainians build them themselves. Is there anything that the U.S. has that you would say makes it a modern military in the 21st century modern warfare? Is there any way that you can argue that the US still has an edge? Because it doesn't seem like we do anywhere. Everything that we've sent, everything we do just doesn't work, isn't effective.
Right. Well, we do have actually a very large edge vis-a-vis the Russians, in, let's say, the number of aircraft. If you look at the total number of NATO aircraft, like versus Russian aircraft, it's NATO. Yeah, NATO dominates. There's just really no question about it. And then, of course, it's even more true of the navies. The Russian Navy is very small, They have, I think, one ancient aircraft carrier, and they have a few other vessels, but it's really tiny compared to the American Navy. But I think is what you were really pointing out. I think that is really a 20th century military. Okay, there's still a role, for naval vessels and fighter jets and so on. But that role is a lot smaller than it used to be. And so having, utter dominance in these areas doesn't really mean a whole lot because the new technologies that are out there largely neutralize those kind of military assets. Air defense has become these air defense missiles are much more effective than they used to be. I think I mentioned in a previous program that, let's say if you go 20 years ago, if you were, let's say, flying an F-16 and then you detected that, a surface to air missile was coming your way, you would immediately take evasive action. And if you were a very good pilot, you would probably evade it. Maybe the odds were very much in your favor. It would be very scary, but you could evade it. Now it's just not true. If you detect that surface to air missile coming at you, you just know you press the eject button, curtains, it's just that. So yeah, things have changed. It's not like there's no role for these jets anymore, but their uses have been limited. We just talked about with the Russians. The Russians have an air force, which is important. They launch these glide bombs. They launch certain kinds of missiles that need to be launched, like the Kinzhals that need to be launched from the air. They're launching platforms. And they're used in that regard, and they do play an important role. But even with the greatly reduced air defenses of the Ukrainians, they still have to be careful. So they tend to, they very rarely do they actually fly directly over Ukrainian forces. They launch these weapons from a distance. Now they can get closer because, again, Ukrainian air defense has been greatly graded, so they can get much closer than they used to. But they still have to be careful. That just tells you something. And the same principle, of course, applies to the navies. It's just that we've talked about this before. It's just that with the advent of hypersonic missiles and so on, all naval vessels are vulnerable. And we can see that again in the Ukraine war. I mean, that was you could say that was a success of the Ukrainians, is that they did manage to sink some Russian naval vessels, including their flagship early in the conflict. And the Russians have ended up moving, all their navy, farther to the east. They used to be stationed at Sevastopol, and now they're, somewhere closer to Rostov. Maybe that's where they are. So again, it's not like these ships don't have, aren't worth anything, but but with this new technology, in the case of like the Ukrainians this time, it wasn't hypersonic missiles. There was, I think, an anti-ship missile that probably brought down the flagship early in the conflict, of course, supplied by the Americans. But they've been using water drones.
Right.
Yeah. And those are, again, it's drones. This 21st century warfare is really about drones, and it's changed everything. So these huge advantages, again, that the West has, that was great in the 20th century, but it just doesn't mean nearly as much now.
I'm going to ask you something that I know is going to piss off a lot of people, but do you think that America is a military superpower still?
Well, it's a tough question. I have my doubts. Before, I didn't have any doubts. Let's put it this way. Before this conflict broke out, I didn't have any doubts. America had the most powerful military on the planet. That was just repeated so often. Partly, when you look at how much we spend about as much as the rest of the world combined. That used to be true, I think, 10 years ago. And now it's like we spend as much as maybe 55%, or I should say 45% of the world or something. Anyway, it's nearly half. Uh, we account for nearly half of all military spending on the planet. So the natural assumption is that that means something, and that tells you what kind of military the U.S. has. But we've learned in the course of this conflict that how much you spend does not equal, you know, how good a military force you have. And yeah, there's this fact. Okay, yeah, we spend a lot of money, but that doesn't tell us how strong we are. It's clearly that we're not nearly that the military we have was purchased at much too high a price. That all these weapon systems are greatly overpriced. And then there's the mismatch that we're just talking about. We've poured all kinds of money into our Navy and our Air Force, but that's really 20th century warfare. And then, okay, we do have a fairly large military force. I think somewhere not too far south of 1 million. When we're talking about enlisted soldiers, but and some of them do have combat experience. That actually sets them apart from a lot of countries in the world, like China. That's one problem. China, the last war they fought was around 1980 with maybe it was 1979 against Vietnam. And so basically nobody in the Chinese military has actual combat experience. Nobody in the European militaries has actual combat experience. Well, maybe now a few do because some have gone as mercenaries and have helped out, but we're talking about very small numbers. The U.S. does have more combat experience because it's been involved in more wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but that's a very different kind of war. So they don't have the combat experience that you would need for a war against a peer adversary like Russia. So I guess what I'm saying is that, maybe I'm not ready to say that we're not a superpower. We have, we're only second to Russia in the number of nuclear weapons. We can blow up the planet several times over. We do have, a pretty impressive intercontinental missile force. So yeah, let's say I guess I would just leave it there. It's just that okay, before I was sure, yeah, no question about it. We're a superpower. We're the best in the world. Now I have my doubts. Often you never know until the fighting really begins, and then you find out, what first of all, like how um, are these soldiers, they've been on paper, they can be very impressive, but maybe they don't want to fight. Maybe, in past wars, American soldiers were willing to sacrifice their lives for these causes. But we've seen a real, let's say, decline in the faith in public institutions in this country. And that extends to the military. We've talked about that earlier. There are a lot of military families in the U.S. where, the generation after generation have gone and enlisted in the U.S. military. And some of those families are, those, let's say the fathers now are coming back home and telling their sons, don't do it. This is a corrupt military. These causes are not worth dying for. And, there's all kinds of nonsense, in social engineering within the militaries. And, it's not a healthy environment. So that's another question. It's just a whole question of morale, of the willingness to fight, the willingness to sacrifice. And sometimes you don't know until the bullets start flying. I guess, I think there's no question. And actually, recently, some very interesting articles came out, including one I was just reading last night. I haven't finished. There's no question that in my mind, in a conflict between NATO, which includes the U.S., and Russia would win. If we're talking about a conventional war there in Europe, that Russia would win. And that's what, was, I think an increasing number of military analysts are now concluding.
It sounds like then we're saying that the United States is not a military superpower unless you define a military superpower as having enough nuclear weapons to enact Armageddon. which is basically that's our only card really to play. And then you say, well, does that make Pakistan or India also a military superpower if you define it
Yeah.
by nuclear weapons? But if you take that out, I don't think you can argue really in any way that the U.S. is a military superpower anymore. And I know that's just so crazy to say, but I think it's really true. And the thing is, you don't know the power of your military until you fight a war. What we've been doing in the Middle East against third world countries doesn't count. We finally fought a real peer adversary and realized, oh, we are lagging way behind. We're lagging way behind in military technology with the inability to develop effective electronic warfare, effective air defense, effective. We can't even develop hypersonic missiles. And then a huge thing as well is just that we don't have a manufacturing base here. We don't have factories that we can turn on to churn things out, to churn out drones, to churn out things that are truly needed. We just have the World War II Vietnam War military. You got your Black Hawk helicopters, which are really cool. I mean, of course, the Air Force, like you said, plays a role, but it really complementary to only if you have sufficient air defenses and things in place to you can't just fly over Russia and bomb it. Those days are
Right.
over, and
Right.
then the Navy is worthless. So anytime I take a look at it, it just seems like there's no way that we can really say that we're a military superpower anymore. But that just breaks people's minds. They don't want to hear it. And if I
Yeah.
ever post a clip
Yeah.
like that
Well,
explaining what
I
you
guess,
say,
right. Maybe that's just why I'm reluctant to say no. It's just sort of like there's this inertia. You just grow up with like, hey, we're number one. And I think it really was true for a long, long time, from the end of World War II, through the unipolar moment at least until the early 2000s. But the world has changed since then. Both even though China lacks the combat experience, and I think that's really very important. I mean, their productive capacity is so huge. That's something that I didn't actually get into, and you mentioned, is that when we're comparing militaries, and we're talking about a war of attrition, which looks like from what we're seeing in Ukraine, that's the kind of war that's being fought. It's not just this quick and easy war of a quick exchange of missiles and then it's over. No, we're talking about years long wars. And for that, the winner is going to have superior production capacity. And so that's another factor. And it's very much in the Russians' favor. We've seen it. But it's hugely in the favor of the Chinese.
right? Yeah, I mean, if anybody listening can produce an argument on why the U.S. military is still a superpower, let me know. Put it in the comments because I don't want to hear that the U.S. has things that they don't even tell you about, that they have these super secret, because that's always the generic response I get. It's like,
Right.
well, we don't even tell you, or when we say something like we lose every single war game with China. I had a lot of people comment saying, well, yeah, we did that on purpose because we won't tell the Chinese. It's just this. That's not an argument. I want to see actual proof.
Right.
I mean, the other thing that people always say is that, oh, well,
Right.
we weren't really trying in Ukraine. If we really wanted to, give them our best stuff, we would. And then the Russians wouldn't stand a chance. Is there any credence to that argument?
Oh, it's clear that we've done everything. We've gone all out. It's just remember we've been crossing our own red lines. At first, we're saying, "Oh, we better not do this." Like, I remember Biden back in 2022 saying, "Oh yeah, we're not sending any Abrams tanks. Look, we don't want World War III." Well, they ended up sending Abrams tanks. They ended up sending many different weapon systems that they were reluctant to send at first. First, I think there are different concerns. One is that let's not escalate too much. This is scary, and there are sensible people back in the Pentagon and other places in the U.S. government that did not want to escalate. But the other thing is to say we don't really have that many weapons. We have these stockpiles aren't that huge, and we don't have the production capacity. Don't give them too much. We ended up giving everything, so to the point where we are forced to draw from our monthly production. So that just tells you we went all out, and the Europeans did too. I mean, there's some cases like the UK and Denmark, they gave, when you talk about certain classes of weapon systems, they gave everything. Like Denmark doesn't have any more howitzers. I think like the UK has virtually no tanks left. The ones that they have are barely operable. Um, what else? What else can they do? Short of actually sending troops, and we've talked about that, the boots on the ground, or going to some sort of really truly long range missiles, like the Tomahawk or something. But again, we've seen with every one of these weapon systems that each one is much ballyhooed. It's always going to be a game changer. It's always a wonder weapon, and every time the Russians neutralize it, sometimes it'll give them some problems at first, like I think HIMARS initially did. But they now you hardly ever hear about it, except when a HIMARS is directed against a civilian target. That's when it's directed against a hardened defense target. It just doesn't do anything. The Russians shoot it down. Yeah, it's not for lack of trying on the part of the West. It clearly they really tried, and now they come to the point. And we haven't even gone into the economic sanctions, right? They did everything. I mean, it's short of actually launching World War III. And so that now you just have the crazies, like Zelensky himself and some of the Baltic presidents who seem to be eager for World War III. But most of the Western establishment, thank God, does not want to go down that path. They fired all the rounds, and what else can they do? I mean, what else can you ask of them? Tell me, if you think that they really didn't try, then what other weapon system can they send? Let's be specific, and you really can't point to anything.
What I really want is I want vindication. This has been, it's just so mind blowing to me that the U.S. This is such the biggest impact I think of this war. One of the largest impacts is that just the showing that the U.S. military is just incapable, incompetent, is a paper tiger, that NATO is. Like, that's so hard to believe. Like, just me asking you that question, it was very difficult for you to answer it, because we are trained so much to just say, yeah, America number one, no doubt. And then now it's just like, I don't even know if we're top 5, top 10. And that's just the reality. It's like, and you just, if you break it down rationally, if you just wipe out everything, I mean, even if you take in the things that happened in the past 20 years before the SMO launched, before the Ukraine war started, it's like, can you say that Afghanistan was a success? We look at what's been happening with the Houthis. It just, everything, it's all a lie. It's all a lie. And like you said, we're just emptied out. We don't have any munitions left. We're drawing on monthly supply. Denmark doesn't have anything. Maybe this was just a clever ploy, that now Denmark can't defend Greenland. Now Trump can just roll in. They don't have a single thing. Now, it just shows that Europe itself is just is nothing. Militarily, it is nothing.
Yeah, right.
It's just
It's actually the United States clearly is a superpower vis-a-vis Europe. Europe is just in pathetic shape. I mean, we've said that, okay, they have a certain number of combat soldiers. They're larger countries, 60,000, I think, combat capable soldiers in the UK, for example. But these studies say, because they've already depleted their stockpiles, which weren't all that huge to begin with. Yeah, we could send them there and they could fight for about a week. It's just like, and then we're out. So, what are you talking about?
Right. Yeah, this illusion of power that the United States projected for so long has led, the European continent to just become complacent and not actually think about their own interests, defensively or whatever. Luckily for Europe, though, Russia has no intention of rolling through Europe and taking them over. So they don't really need to worry about that. They should probably worry more about Trump coming in. It's like, I took Greenland and maybe Iceland next, Just, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that's more likely to happen than Putin moving into Poland, for example. But so for Europe, okay, they're complacent. They don't have they're not a military power by any means, but they're not really under threat. But Israel is a different situation, because Israel's power projection is based on the fact that we got the United States behind us. This 800-pound gorilla that will beat the crap out of anybody that touches Israel. But we're realizing that that's not so true. That 800-pound gorilla, we're looking at it and it's like, ooh, you look like it's more like a 25-pound emaciated
Yeah.
spider monkey,
Right.
But
Well, I
it,
think actually, like when you're talking about poor countries in the Middle East, we're still the 800-pound gorilla. And Israel is too, with our backing, they are. I just want
then what are
again,
the
they could, well,
Houthis?
okay, it's not that simple. That's not that simple. They have air superiority in places like Lebanon, for example, and they can just do what they will. Now Syria. Before they couldn't. We saw the difference when Assad fell. They moved in. There was a vacuum. It was clear that actually they were afraid of those systems that he had, the S-300s, right? So they didn't dare go into that airspace. But now they can bomb at will, like they've been bombing at will in Lebanon. I mean, again, um, yeah, in terms of, let's say, air superiority, they are the 800-pound gorilla. But when they try to go in on the land, they just never got more than like a mile from the border, and they fought for, what was it, 2 3 months. And clearly, they fought hard, but they just couldn't. And this was against, Hezbollah, which is not even a state army. But so yeah, you can see the limitations of the Israeli military on the ground anyway.
Right. Yeah. If I feel like people need to recognize the reality, and it's very difficult to recognize that the U.S. is not all powerful. It's not even powerful anymore
Well, it's
militarily.
powerful. I wouldn't
I
say that it's powerful.
yeah, well, it depends.
Yeah,
Sure, maybe it's power.
yeah,
I
it's
mean,
just
how
like the
powerful
Russians,
compared to
right?
what? Compared to Yemen, are we powerful? I mean, if we really wanted to take
Well,
over, I
okay.
guess
Well,
we
we
could.
are. I mean, yeah, but right. I
The
mean, if we
poorest
actually
country in the
decided to
world.
go to, yeah, right. No, no, no. It's true. It's again, it just shows the new nature of warfare, and this huge navy that we have really was not able to accomplish its mission in the Red Sea. It's just clear. It's been there. It's not for one of trying. We've been bombing Yemen continually, or more or less continually, or over the course of many months now, and we did not. The mission remains unaccomplished.
Right.
Again, as you point out, just about the poorest country in the world, and we couldn't do it. So that should be a wake up call, no question about it.
Right. And if you really care about having a strong military in the United States, then I would say that the first step is to have some humility, to recognize that
Yeah,
there are problems. The problem is that we just refuse. Our
yeah,
approach to it is just you cannot touch this sacred cow of the almighty U.S. military. Everything it does
right,
is
right.
fantastic and perfect. If you really care about it and want it to improve, you be rational and recognize like, oh, we don't have the drone technology, we don't have hypersonics, don't have good air defense, we don't have any manufacturing capacity anymore.
Yeah, well,
This
we've got to go
country is
back to the
hollowed out.
drawing board. We're going to have to rework this whole thing. Yeah, but it's just so it's an easy, lazy way of dealing with the situation is that you just deny it, and you thump your chest and you wave your America number one foam glove or whatever. Um, and that's what we get from our politicians with virtually no exceptions. I mean, that's just um, what we do. But in fact, that kind of reaction weakens us. It hides the real problems. It closes their eyes to the solutions. And yes, some honest talk, like I think that we are engaged in right here, is actually would be the best thing for the American military. And I think probably the most important thing is just that, hey, let's just talk about what the role of the military really should be. This is not 1946 or 1952. And, this is a whole new world. And it is just not possible for us to rule the world. These other powers are growing and they will continue to grow. That's just kind of a natural phenomena that we cannot stop. And we just have to understand that a multipolar world is ahead of us. And then we need to um, um, just adjust our thinking accordingly and say, okay, the purpose of our military is not to maintain hegemony throughout the world, but rather just to defend the homeland. And if you have a much humbler and a realistic, practical um, objective or for your military, then you can also then Well, yeah, your nation is going to be stronger. I mean, it's part of the is again a military rests on an economic foundation, and the huge amounts of money that we're wasting on this. Not only is it bad for the military, as we say, we're these overpriced systems, but it's bad for the country. I mean, the whole thing needs to be reconsidered at every level, and we're just not doing that. Occasionally there are a few voices in the wilderness, but we're not responding to them. So. I think we continue. It's just the easy thing for a politician to do, and politicians almost always do the easy thing. What gives them short-term benefits, and that is to thump your chest and say we're number one, and how dare you think otherwise? And let's continue doing what we've been doing. Everybody's very happy with the system. We're all being enriched by it. So why change? It'll take a real disaster, and I don't know where it'll happen in the world. It could happen in Ukraine. It could happen in the Middle East. It could happen off the coast of China. But some kind of real disaster where aircraft carriers are sunk, or something on that order that will wake us up. You would hope.
You would hope that the Ukraine war and the Red Sea with the Houthis would wake us up. That this is we're not there. I mean. What's so scary is that, we thump our chests and we say that we're number one, but we're clearly not, just from everything we've discussed this past 20 minutes, just explaining why the U.S. military is not powerful. It's not a 21st century military. But at the same time, we aren't, but we act like we are, and we have this idea that we always have to have an enemy, that we have to take on Iran, we have to take on China, we got to take on Russia, when we don't stand a chance against any of these countries. Like this is what's so scary and dangerous and just ridiculous, and the fact that all these countries are, allying themselves with each other. They're forming this new bloc. This, we had that agreement between Russia and Iran. China and Russia are very tight. So this is the dangerous part of it. Is this? Will there be a recognition? And then I think, like you said, there is some recognition within the Pentagon. But we have to break the mentality that we always have to have an enemy. It's so crazy to want to try to pick an enemy when we are so weak militarily vis-a-vis China or Russia.
Yeah.
So can we break that mentality?
It's just that we need to, again, it's really not a foreign concept. The idea of actual national humility. That was the idea that this nation was founded on. Again, that we were not to go out and seek monsters to slay, right? But rather that we should be the shining city on the hill. In other words, that we should lead by example. We build up a good society, a good political system here in this country, and exercise our power in that way, through moral leadership. That was really the original idea. And then that was upended, and we just became focused on these various crusades. I think you probably, it started to break down, I guess, around the time of the Civil War. But through the course of several wars, we'd be kind of a crusading nation. And we need to return to our Republican roots. We need to abandon that. We could get away with it when we truly were, the most powerful country in the world. And we were after 1945, for a good, 25 or maybe a couple generations from there. But it's just no longer true. And it inevitably, always was going to end. It's not strange that it has ended. The natural course of things. Other countries, it's not like they're congenitally incapable of building up strong economies and strong militaries. Of course, they were always capable. For various reasons, they were behind, but these were, historically contingent reasons. And history moves on, and now we live in this new world that's clearly becoming a multipolar world. We need to crusading mentality, just looking for the enemy. Again, there was a time when maybe it served a purpose during the Cold War, and it corresponded in some sense to reality, to our strength, but that the reality has changed, and we need to set aside that thinking. It's a very dangerous combination, really, is to be a crusading power, an ideologically zealous power like what we've become, that is intent on maintaining, a global hegemony, yet the reality underneath is shifting, and we just don't have the means to do it. That's where we are, and that's dangerous. We have two main options. Is one is that, okay, let's return to Republican roots. Let's accept the reality. Let's become a humbler nation. Okay, let's accept the multipolar world. Or we can,
Go
we
boom.
could go boom, right? It's just that we can insist on trying to hang on to every last piece of territory. We lash out at all our enemies and engender new conflicts. And, eventually that's going to, right, end disastrously. There's no question about it. Now, it's sort of funny. I was just thinking about that, these two options. Well, maybe that's not what we're quite seeing with Trump. Trump is sort of something in the middle, right? He defies categorization. He's not a neocon, as we've said many times. He's not really he's not interested in these ideological crusades, and he seems to actually respect the idea of other powers in the world. And one level, he's a little bit more open to multipolarity. I think, that you can see that in a lot of the statements that he makes. But he is obsessed with American power. And, just to give you an example, what recently, I think he repeated his threat against BRICS. If they go to try to create their own currency, he's going to punish all of them. He's
100%
talking like,
tariffs.
yeah, right. He's talking like a global hegemon right there. So, you find a little bit in Trump, as it with so many issues, you find him sort of on both sides of it. I think you could describe him as a transitional figure. Potentially, that's what he's going to be. That's when we look at him, maybe historians look at him 50 years from now, that, yeah, he was a transitional figure. He still had a lot of the old thinking, but some of the new thinking was also began to appear in him. And so we just hope that that he is kind of a bridge, and maybe future presidents will actually start to continue to move, and maybe more consistently move in the direction of multipolarity.
Mhm. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting if you think about the age of American dominance. Really, it didn't even span 100 years. It was a very short-lived empire where we were on
Hmm.
top, right? It's really, in the grand scheme of things, it's quite short. We squandered it so quickly. And
Yeah.
do you think, just historically, is this pretty the situation the United States is in? Is this pretty standard historically, where you do have one hegemon and then another one comes on top, or has
Yeah.
traditionally should we view the world in a multipolar sense? Because back then people didn't, there were we weren't so interconnected, so you couldn't really control the whole world like
Yeah.
things that the U.S. tried
Right.
to do at least. You know what I
Well,
mean?
yeah, you can say like the age of the global hegemons. Maybe that doesn't is not exactly the right term, but it began with Western expansion and Western colonization. You could go back all the way to the Portuguese. They weren't really global hegemons. I mean, they did rule the seas, or at least a good
When is
portion of
this?
them. Okay, the Portuguese were talking about going back to the 16th century. So they had trading posts and military bases in far-flung places like Taiwan, even just all around the world. But they didn't really rule, maybe rule the world in any real sense. They didn't. Um, they had just a port, for example, on the coast of India, but they didn't rule India. So you couldn't really call them a global hegemon. It's really maybe the first global hegemon really was Great Britain. So it's actually fairly recent. They grew out of that sort of expansionist colonial experience of the West. But that, of course, is all ended. You had the British. There was a time, like you go 100 years ago, Europe and America actually were so far advanced, had advanced so far beyond the rest of the world that you really could talk about global hegemony. They didn't have any rivals. China at one time was a great power. If you go to the Tang Dynasty, it would be approximately 900 AD. China was clearly the most powerful empire in the world at that time. but it was not a global hegemon because there wasn't even, they had very little contact with the West. These different regions of the world were pretty much isolated from each other. It was only with the expansion of the Europeans, towards in recent centuries, that you actually started to have, these powers um, left their own regions and spread out and actually did extend rule over the world. So that was a historically unique period of time. That time has come to an end. China again is a great power. India is in the process of becoming a great power. Russia, temporarily ceased to be a great power during the 1990s, but now is a great power once again. So it's just that kind of thinking um, that arose during that period of, let's say, approximately 200 years of Western colonialism. Um, is just no longer, it's anachronistic. It's just not, it doesn't recognize the current realities. The current realities are something completely different. So to talk about some sort of global hegemony now, I know that's generally not the term. I think actually Boris Johnson actually blurted it out once. Generally, what they say is a rules-based international order, but that's just a code word for global hegemony. It's time to set aside the rules-based international order and accept the new realities.
So this idea of being a global power is really pretty unique to the West. It was never something that Russia envisioned or China envisioned, right? This was a Western thing, and you can say going back
Yeah.
200 years or even potentially 500 years if you want to go all the way back to the Portuguese. But that so it's almost seems like it's been ingrained in kind of Western mentality, the idea that there needs to be a hegemon. And I think that's the problem
Uh-huh.
that we have, is that we envision that this is the way that everybody else thinks. This is the way that China thinks. This is
Yeah.
the way that Russia thinks, that they're going to take over the global power. But really,
Right.
this idea of being a global power, if we look at it through history, it's an anomaly. It was a unique
Uh-huh.
experience within the West during a short period of time because there was a huge technological leap within Western Europe over the rest of the world,
Right.
which allowed it to
Right.
happen. That
Right.
technological leap doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And traditionally before then it wasn't around, so there was never. That's not the norm. The norm is not to be a global power like that.
Right.
It allowed to happen because of technological advantages hundreds of years ago in Western Europe. That's
Yeah.
basically it, right?
Right. Some unique historical circumstances that just no longer exist. And yeah, I mean, it's just that, it's not that, like, this whole idea of multipolarity is not some sort of newfangled idealistic um, utopian vision. It's actually just, it's the default setting, you can say. It's just the way the world has been. It was for centuries or millennia. And so we're actually just reverting to really sort of a normality. It was just
Right.
that we're abandoning the exception and just returning to normality. And the normal way of things was for a great power to exist in one region of the world and to exert influence within that region. So, for example, certainly China, Imperial China had its sphere of influence. It didn't rule these countries around them, but it expected them to show their respects, uh, to um, to give tributes to, but and more importantly, to kind of um, to to understand, or to pursue policies that were not going to be conflict with the core interests of China itself. So that's a sphere of influence, and that's something that has existed forever. So if we're talking about spheres of influence, that's not some newfangled concept. That's just that's again um, the normal way of doing things in the world. That's what we're returning to. So Trump, in his own way, in a very inconsistent way, it seems to be pushing back towards that. It's not that that's like I've said before, it doesn't mean it's not a utopian vision. It's not like there will never be wars again. There will be. And there's always the danger of one of these powers becoming an expansionist. But um, it is in the end, I think, just a much healthier and more realistic view of things. It's just, what we have now is unrealistic, and it's not, it, sometimes you find like neocons speaking against spheres of influence, but their idea is what they're mad about is not that really that fact that a country has influence around its surrounding countries. What they're mad about is that the U.S. is finding it, as resistance to imposing its own global sphere of influence, and that's what we're looking at. So it's not really it's a realistic notion of spheres of influence that you find with multipolarity. The neocons, in truth, have their own notion of a sphere of influence, but it's unrealistic and very dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, Dad. Well, I think we're over an hour, so we can end it there unless there's any parting words you'd like to say.
No, enjoy your weekend.
Okay. All right. Have a great weekend. Thanks a lot, Dad.
You too.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.